Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. Something happened a few weeks ago that I still can't explain, and the memories continue to haunt my waking hours. It was a Saturday morning in October 2022, and I had just dragged myself out of bed after another grueling week at the construction site. My body ached from 10 hours of concrete pouring the day before, and my head felt like it was stuffed with cotton. The autumn rain pelted against my apartment windows, creating an endless drumbeat that matched my sluggish heartbeat. I was contemplating whether to make coffee or just crawl back under the covers when my phone buzzed against the nightstand. The caller ID showed my brother's name, and I reluctantly swiped to answer. "Hey, how are you doing?" His voice was unusually cheerful for someone calling before noon on a weekend. With my groggy head still swimming, I replied, "Man, I just woke up. What's up?" He laughed. That familiar sound that had gotten us both into trouble countless times growing up. "Okay, bro. So we both don't have anything to do this weekend, right?" "Yeah, I know. Do you have a plan?" I rubbed my eyes, trying to focus on whatever scheme he was cooking up. "Sounds like that's why you might have called me," I added, knowing my brother's patterns all too well.
Yep, we're both free for the weekend, and the old man is free anyway because he's retired. So why don't we guys just go have a good time in Germany on a beer tour?
The idea struck me as simultaneously brilliant and completely insane. We lived in eastern France, so Germany wasn't impossibly far, but a spontaneous international drinking expedition seemed like the kind of decision we'd regret. Then again, when had that ever stopped us before? "All right," I heard myself saying. "Sounds fun to me." As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and apprehension. There was something about the timing that felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. The rain continued its relentless assault on the windows, and for just a moment I thought I heard something else mixed in with the weather. A sound like distant laughter, though that was probably just my imagination playing tricks on me. I shook off the odd feeling and started packing a bag. After all, what could go wrong with a few days of German beer and family bonding? 3 days later, we were on the road in my brother's aging Volkswagen, which wheezed and groaned with every hill we climbed. The October landscape of eastern France gave way to the rolling hills of southwestern Germany, and despite the car's mechanical complaints, our spirits were high. My father Bernard sat in the passenger seat with a road map spread across his lap. He refused to trust GPS, claiming it was just another way for them to track your movements. "Turn here," he announced, jabbing his finger at an intersection that looked identical to the dozen we'd already passed. My brother Laurent gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Dad, that's the third time you've said that about the exact same road." No, this is different. See that sign? That wasn't there before." I leaned forward from the back seat to get a better look. The sign was weathered and covered in what looked like decades of accumulated grime. The German text was barely legible, and something about the way the letters seemed to shift in the afternoon light made me uneasy. It was probably just fatigue from the drive, but I could have sworn the words changed when I wasn't looking directly at them. "Are you sure that's the right way?" I asked, though I couldn't explain why I felt so reluctant about that particular route. "Trust me," Bernard said, folding the map with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been navigating before satellites existed. "I've been reading maps since before you two were born." We turned down the indicated road, and almost immediately, the landscape began to change. The rolling hills became steeper, more heavily forested. The trees seemed to press closer to the narrow asphalt, their branches creating a canopy so thick that even in broad daylight we were driving through a tunnel of shadows. The temperature in the car seemed to drop, though none of us had touched the air conditioning. "Well, this is atmospheric," Laurent muttered, turning on the headlights even though it was only mid-afternoon. For the next hour, we drove through countryside that seemed increasingly isolated. We passed no other vehicles, saw no houses, and encountered no other signs of human habitation. The silence in the car grew heavy, broken only by the engine's labored breathing and the occasional creak of settling metal. Bernard kept checking the map, his confidence gradually giving way to confusion. We should have reached the main road by now." "Maybe we should turn back," I suggested. though the words felt strange in my mouth. Part of me wanted to keep driving deeper into this strange landscape, despite every rational instinct screaming the opposite. No, no, Bernard waved dismissively. We're committed now. Besides, look, there's something up ahead. Through the windshield, we could see a break in the tree line. As we crested a small hill, a valley spread out below us, and nestled at its heart was what appeared to be a small village. Smoke rose from chimneys, and warm yellow light glowed in windows. It looked like something from a postcard, almost too picturesque to be real. See, Bernard said triumphantly. I told you this was the right way. But as we descended toward the village, I noticed something that made my stomach clench with an inexplicable dread. There were no people visible anywhere. No one walking the streets, no children playing, no signs of movement except for that steady rise of smoke from the chimneys. The place looked inhabited but somehow empty, like a movie set waiting for actors who would never arrive. The village turned out to be larger than it had appeared from the hill, with winding cobblestone streets that seemed designed to confuse rather than guide. We drove in circles for nearly 20 minutes before Laurent finally spotted a sign pointing toward what appeared to be the only hotel in town. The building was old but well-maintained, with flower boxes under the windows and a hand-painted sign that read, Gasthaus zum Schwarzwald, the Black Forest Inn. Well, this looks promising, Laurent said, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. We parked in a small lot behind the building and gathered our bags. The air was noticeably colder here than it had been just a few miles back, and the silence was almost complete. No traffic noise, no distant conversations, not even the sound of birds. It was as if the entire village existed in some kind of acoustic bubble. The hotel's front door was heavy wood bound with iron straps, like something from a medieval fortress. It opened with a groan that seemed to echo through the building's interior. The lobby was warm and inviting, with exposed wooden beams and a crackling fireplace, but something about the atmosphere felt forced, as if someone had worked very hard to create the appearance of coziness. Behind the reception desk stood a woman I hadn't seen in nearly 15 years, though she looked virtually unchanged. Her auburn hair was pulled back in the same style she'd worn as a teenager, and her smile was just as bright as I remembered. "Oh my God," she said, her face lighting up with genuine surprise. "I don't believe it." She came around the desk and wrapped her arms around my neck, pulling me into a hug that brought back a flood of memories. Summer nights at the campground where our families had vacationed, long walks through pine forests, the innocent romance of youth. "Jeanette," I exclaimed, pulling back to look her in the eye. "You look amazing. What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," she laughed. "This is my place now. Well, mine and my husband's." My father and brother exchanged glances, clearly trying to piece together the connection. I quickly explained. "This is Jeanette from the old campground we used to go to when I was young. You remember, Dad? The one near Strasbourg?" Bernard nodded slowly, though I could see he was still processing the coincidence. What were the odds of randomly encountering someone from my past in a remote German village? "Well, any friend of my son's is a friend of the family," Bernard said with his characteristic warmth. "I'm Bernard, and this is Laurent." Jeanette's smile widened. "In that case, drinks are on the house tonight. Consider it a reunion celebration." As she led us to our rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that her appearance wasn't quite as coincidental as it seemed. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition that went beyond our shared history, as if she had been expecting us. But that was ridiculous, wasn't it? How could she have known we were coming when we'd only decided on the trip 3 days ago? "Your rooms are on the second floor," she said, handing us old-fashioned skeleton keys. "Dinner is served until 9, and the bar stays open as long as there are customers." As we climbed the narrow wooden staircase, our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet building. I found myself counting the doors we passed, noting that several appeared to be sealed shut with what looked like fresh paint. When I mentioned this to Laurent, he just shrugged. "Old building," he said. "Probably renovations." But as we reached our floor, I caught sight of something that made me pause. Through a window at the end of the hallway, I could see the forest beyond the village, dense, dark trees that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. And somewhere in that darkness, I could swear I saw points of light flickering like distant stars, or perhaps like eyes watching us from the tree line. I blinked, and when I looked again, the lights were gone. By evening, the hotel's common room had filled with what I assumed were locals, though their conversations were conducted in hushed tones that made it impossible to catch more than a few words. The atmosphere was convivial enough, with traditional German folk music playing softly from speakers hidden somewhere in the wooden walls, but there was an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't quite identify. Jeanette had changed into a traditional dirndl that emphasized her figure, and she moved through the room with the practiced ease of someone who had been running a hospitality business for years. She brought us beer after beer, each mug larger than the last, and regaled us with stories of how she'd met her husband, a local businessman who owned not just the hotel but several other properties in the region. "He's away on business," she explained when Bernard asked about meeting him, "but he'll be back tomorrow. I'm sure he'd love to meet you." As the evening wore on, the combination of strong German beer and the warmth of the fireplace began to work its magic. Bernard was the first to succumb, yawning widely and announcing that he was too old for this kind of marathon drinking session. Laurent lasted about an hour longer before declaring defeat and heading upstairs, but not before tossing me his room key. "Just in case you need a backup," he said with a knowing wink. "Have fun, but be smart about it." Once my family had retired, the atmosphere in the common room shifted subtly. The other patrons seemed to draw closer to their tables, their conversations becoming even quieter. Jeanette took a seat across from me, pouring herself a glass of what looked like homemade schnapps. "So," she said, studying my face in the firelight, "what brings you to this particular corner of Germany? And don't tell me it was just random chance." I was about to insist that it had been exactly that when I noticed something that made me pause. Sitting alone at a corner table was a young woman with striking black hair that seemed to absorb the light around it. She couldn't have been older than 25, and she was beautiful in a way that made you want to stare even though you knew you shouldn't. But there was something unsettling about her presence. She hadn't touched the drink in front of her, and she seemed to be listening intently to every word of our conversation. "Who's that?" I asked, nodding slightly in her direction. Jeanette followed my gaze, and I watched her expression change. The warmth disappeared from her eyes, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "Ingrid," she said quietly, taking a large sip of her schnapps. "She's new to the area, moved here a few months ago with some friends. She seems interested in our conversation." "She's interested in a lot of things," Jeanette replied cryptically. "Maybe too many things." I was about to ask what she meant when Jeanette grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my flesh with surprising strength. "Listen to me carefully," she whispered, her voice urgent. "I know this sounds crazy, but there are some people in this area who are involved in, let's call them alternative spiritual practices. They have meetings in the forest, and they're very serious about their privacy." "You mean like a hiking club?" Jeanette's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Not exactly. More like the kind of group that takes their beliefs very, very seriously. The kind that doesn't appreciate outsiders stumbling into their business." I glanced back at Ingrid, who was now looking directly at us with those dark eyes. When our gazes met, she smiled, but there was something predatory about the expression, like a cat that had just spotted a particularly interesting mouse. "Are you trying to scare me away from her?" I asked. "I'm trying to keep you alive," Jeanette replied, and the absolute sincerity in her voice sent a shiver down my spine. Despite Jeanette's warning, or perhaps because of it, I found myself drawn to Ingrid's table. There was something magnetic about her presence, something that made rational thought difficult. As I approached, she looked up with those impossibly dark eyes and smiled. "You're not from around here," she said. Her accent was German, but there was something else underneath it, something I couldn't quite identify. "Just visiting with my family," I replied, taking the seat across from her without invitation. "What about you?" "I moved here recently. The forest called to me." It was an odd way to phrase it, but something in her tone suggested she meant it literally. As we talked, I found myself drawn deeper into conversation with her. She spoke about the history of the region, about old traditions that had been practiced in these woods for centuries, about the way modern life had disconnected people from their true nature. "Would you like to see something special?" she asked after we'd been talking for nearly an hour. "What kind of something?" "The forest at night is different, more honest, more real." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to politely decline and head to my room, but there was something hypnotic about her voice, something that made saying no feel impossible. "Sure," I heard myself saying. "That sounds interesting." As we left the hotel, I caught sight of Jeanette behind the bar. She was staring at us with an expression of pure horror. shaking her head almost imperceptibly. But by then, it was too late to change my mind without seeming rude. The village streets were completely deserted, illuminated only by the occasional street lamp that cast long shadows between the old buildings. Ingrid led me toward the forest edge, where a narrow trail disappeared into the darkness between the trees. She moved with the confidence of someone who knew these paths intimately, while I stumbled along behind her, trying to keep up. "How far are we going?" I asked after we'd been walking for what felt like miles. "Not much further," she replied, though her voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The forest around us was alive with sounds. The rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant call of night birds, the whisper of wind through leaves. But underneath all of that was another sound, something rhythmic and low that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Do you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" But when I looked at Ingrid, she was smiling in a way that suggested she knew exactly what I meant. The trail began to slope downward, and I realized we were descending into some kind of natural bowl in the forest floor. The trees here were older, larger, their trunks twisted into strange shapes that looked almost like human figures in the darkness. And as we walked deeper into this woodland cathedral, the rhythmic sound grew stronger. It was chanting. "Ingrid," I said, stopping in my tracks, "what exactly are we doing here?" But when I turned around, she was gone. I called her name, my voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. The chanting continued, seeming to come from all directions at once. I could make out multiple voices now, all female, all speaking in a language I didn't recognize. That was when I saw the light. Through the trees ahead, I could see the flicker of flame, not the steady glow of electric lights, but the wild, dancing illumination of a fire. Against every rational instinct in my body, I crept toward it, moving as quietly as possible through the underbrush. What I saw when I reached the edge of the clearing will haunt me for the rest of my life. 8 women stood in a perfect circle around a massive bonfire that threw their shadows dancing across the surrounding trees. They were all young, all dressed in dark clothing that seemed to blend with the forest itself. And there, unmistakably, was Ingrid, holding something in her hands that made my stomach lurch. It was a cat, or had been. The animal hung limp and motionless, its body twisted at an unnatural angle. As I watched in horror, Ingrid raised it above her head while the other women continued their chanting, their voices rising and falling in a pattern that seemed designed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to some primitive part of the brain. I tried to tell myself that this was some kind of elaborate performance, maybe a local theater group rehearsing for a Halloween production. But the smell that reached me through the night air, metallic, organic, wrong in every possible way, told a different story. The chanting reached a crescendo, and Ingrid threw the dead animal onto the fire. The flames roared higher, and in that moment, all 8 women turned to look directly at me. Their eyes reflected the firelight like mirrors, and their faces wore expressions of savage joy that had nothing to do with humanity. These weren't women playing at being something they weren't. They were something else entirely. Something that had learned to wear human faces when necessary. I don't remember making the conscious decision to run. One moment I was frozen in terror at the edge of the clearing, and the next I was crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. Behind me I could hear them coming, not running, but moving through the forest with the fluid grace of predators who knew their territory intimately. They made sounds as they pursued me, not screams exactly, but something between laughter and the hunting calls of wolves. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the forest itself had joined in the chase. I ran blindly, no longer sure which direction led back to the village, operating purely on panic and adrenaline. Thorns cut my face, low branches struck my chest, and more than once I stumbled and went down hard on the rocky forest floor. But each time, those inhuman sounds drove me back to my feet. Just when I thought my lungs were going to burst and my legs were going to give out entirely, I saw lights ahead, real lights, the warm glow of the village street lamps. I burst out of the forest like a cork from a bottle, gasping and bleeding, my clothes torn and my mind reeling. The pursuit sounds had stopped the moment I left the trees, but when I looked back I could see eyes watching me from the darkness, dozens of them, reflecting the village lights like fallen stars. I made it back to the hotel running on pure adrenaline, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure it would burst. The lobby was empty, the fire reduced to glowing embers, and the silence felt oppressive after the chaos of the forest. I used my key with shaking hands and stumbled into my room, immediately throwing the deadbolt and checking the window locks. For a long time, I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to process what I had witnessed. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as an elaborate prank or some kind of local tradition that had gotten out of hand. But the smell of that fire, the sound of those voices, the way those eyes had reflected the light, none of it felt like theater. I must have dozed off from exhaustion, because the next thing I knew, there was hammering on my door that seemed to shake the entire building. The sound was violent, urgent, like someone was trying to break down the barrier between us rather than simply requesting entry. "Who is it?" I called out, though my voice came out as barely more than a whisper. The hammering stopped abruptly, replaced by a voice I recognized but barely. Ingrid's voice, but transformed into something that made my skin crawl. "Open the door," she said, and each word seemed to carry physical weight. "Open it now." I looked through the peephole and immediately wished I hadn't. Ingrid stood in the hallway, but this wasn't the woman I had met in the bar. Her face was contorted with rage, her features somehow sharper and more angular than they had been before. Her hair hung in wild tangles, and her clothes were stained with something dark. But it was her eyes that made me step back from the door. They were completely black now. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible surface, as if someone had filled them with oil. "I know you're in there," she continued, her voice carrying a tone of absolute authority. "What you saw tonight, you will forget it. You will tell no one, and you will never speak of us again." Despite every rational thought in my head screaming at me to keep the door locked, I found my hand moving toward the deadbolt. There was something compelling about her voice, something that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the part of the brain that controlled movement. "That's right," she whispered, somehow knowing that I was reaching for the lock. "Open the door. Let me in. Let me help you understand." My fingers were actually on the deadbolt when I caught sight of my reflection in the room's mirror. My face was pale, my eyes wide with terror, and there was something about seeing my own fear that snapped me back to awareness. I jerked my hand away from the lock as if it had burned me. "No," I said, and saying it felt like breaking free from invisible chains. "No, I won't." The silence that followed was complete and terrifying. Then, slowly, I heard her footsteps moving away from the door. But instead of the sound of someone walking normally down a hallway, it was more like something large and heavy being dragged across the wooden floor. I looked through the peephole again, and the hallway was empty. But on the door itself, at exactly the height where her face had been, were scratches in the wood. 4 parallel gouges that looked like they had been made by fingernails or claws. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the chair by the window, watching the forest for any sign of movement. As dawn approached, the trees gradually became visible in the growing light, and they looked innocent enough, just ordinary German woodland, beautiful in the morning mist. When I finally worked up the courage to open my door, the hallway was empty and normal. The scratches I had seen on the door were gone, leaving no trace that the night's events had ever occurred. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that I had imagined the entire thing, a nightmare brought on by too much beer and too many of Jeanette's stories. Then I looked down and saw the mud on my shoes, the tears in my clothes, the scratches on my arms from the thorns. Whatever had happened in that forest, it had been real. I found Jeanette in the hotel's small dining room, setting up for breakfast. She took one look at me, and immediately set down the plates she was carrying. "What happened?" she asked, though something in her expression suggested she already knew. I told her everything. The invitation to the forest, the ceremony I had witnessed, the chase through the woods, and the visit to my room. As I spoke, her face grew progressively paler. "I tried to warn you," she said when I finished. "I tried to keep you away from her." "Who is she, really? What was that thing in the forest?" Jeanette looked around the dining room as if checking for eavesdroppers, then leaned closer to me. "There are old practices in these woods," she whispered. "Things that go back centuries, long before Christianity came to this region. Most people dismiss them as folklore, but some still follow the old ways." "You mean witchcraft?" "I mean something much older and much more dangerous than anything you'd find in a fairy tale. These women, they're not playing at being something they're not. They've given themselves over completely to forces that most people can't even imagine." She stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the forest. In the morning light, it looked peaceful and inviting, but I could still remember the sounds I had heard in its depths. The smart thing, Jeanette continued, would be for you and your family to leave today. Right now. Drive back to France and never come back to this region. And if I don't? She turned back to me, and the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. Then you'll find out just how seriously they take their privacy. And trust me, you don't want that. When my father and brother came down for breakfast, I told them we needed to leave immediately. I didn't explain why, just said I had a feeling we should get back home. Bernard grumbled about cutting the trip short, and Laurent made jokes about me being afraid of German beer, but they agreed to pack up and head back to France. As we loaded our bags into the car, I saw Ingrid watching us from across the village square. In the daylight, she looked completely normal again, just a pretty young woman in jeans and a sweater. She smiled and waved as if nothing had happened, but I noticed she never came any closer. We drove out of the village and back through the winding forest road, and with each mile we put between us and that place, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. But even now, weeks later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with the sound of chanting in my ears, and the memory of those black eyes staring at me from the darkness. I never told my father or brother the real reason we left so suddenly, and I never planned to return to that region of Germany. Some experiences are better left in the past, buried under layers of rational explanation and everyday routine. But sometimes on quiet nights when the wind is howling through the trees outside my apartment, I remember the way those women move through the forest, and I wonder if they're still out there in the darkness practicing their ancient rites and waiting for the next curious fool to stumble into their domain. And sometimes I'm absolutely certain that they are. My name is Harold Brown, and I'm 68 years old now. What I'm about to share with you is something that happened to me a few years back when I was working as a park ranger in the rugged wilderness of northern Maine. You know, I took that job thinking it'd be all about fresh air, scenic views, and maybe the occasional rescue mission. Boy, was I wrong. I grew up in a small town in central Maine, the kind of place where everyone knows your name and your business. By the time I hit my early 60s, I was itching for a change. I wanted to get away from the gossip, the familiar faces, to have some space and quiet. That's what led me to apply for a position at Baxter State Park. Baxter State Park is a vast wild area that seemed perfect for getting lost and finding myself. It's over 200,000 acres of pristine wilderness, home to Mount Katahdin, the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. The park is known for its strict preservation rules: no electricity, no running water, and limited access roads. It was exactly the kind of challenge I was looking for. I started my job there in the spring, just as the last of the snow was melting off the peaks. Those first few months were everything I'd hoped for: peaceful, invigorating, and full of new experiences. I learned the trails, got to know the local wildlife, and settled into the rhythm of park life. My fellow rangers became like a second family to me. We shared meals, swapped stories, and looked out for each other in the unpredictable wilderness. But as autumn approached, things began to change. It was subtle at first, a sense of unease that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The winds seemed to whisper warnings as they rustled through the changing leaves. The animals grew more skittish, their behavior erratic. I brushed it off as the normal shift of seasons, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. It was a chilly October morning when everything changed. The kind of morning where you can see your breath, but the sun's bright enough to give you hope for a warmer afternoon. I had just finished my coffee and was checking my gear when my buddy Dave Mullins came over. Dave was a fellow ranger, a bit older than me, with a gruff manner but a heart of gold. He liked to joke around, saying things like, "Hey Harold, you ready to wrestle some bears today?" I always laughed it off, but today his usual humor seemed forced. "Morning, Dave. What's on the agenda today?" I asked, trying to shake off the morning chill and the lingering sense of foreboding. Dave's face was serious as he replied, "Got a call about some hikers who didn't return last night. They were supposed to be back by sunset. You up for a search?" I felt a knot form in my stomach. Missing hikers were never a good sign, especially this late in the season when the weather could turn treacherous in an instant. "Yeah, sure," I replied, grabbing my pack. "Where were they headed?" "Up towards Chimney Pond," Dave said, his brow furrowed with concern. "You know how folks can get turned around up there." I nodded grimly. Chimney Pond was a popular spot, nestled at the base of Mount Katahdin's steep cliffs. It was beautiful, but the terrain could be challenging. especially for inexperienced hikers. As we set off, Dave filled me in on the details. The missing group consisted of 3 hikers, 2 men and a woman, all in their late 20s. They were last seen heading up the trail to Chimney Pond the previous morning. We made our way up the trail, the beauty of the fall foliage in full display around us. Under normal circumstances, I would have reveled in the vibrant reds, oranges, and golds of the turning leaves. But today the colors seemed muted, overshadowed by the gravity of our mission. The hike to Chimney Pond is about 3.3 miles, gaining about 1,500 feet in elevation. Normally it would take us about 2 to 3 hours, but we pushed ourselves, hoping to make better time. As we climbed, the forest grew denser, the shadows deeper. The usual sounds of the woods, birdsong, rustling leaves, the scurrying of small animals, seemed oddly muted. By midday, we reached Chimney Pond and started combing the area. The pond itself was a mirror, reflecting the sheer cliffs of Katahdin that loomed above us. In any other circumstance, the view would have been breathtaking. But now, those cliffs seemed ominous, as if they were hiding secrets in their craggy faces. We split up to cover more ground, agreeing to stay within shouting distance of each other. The forest was eerily silent, just the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional call of a distant bird. I called out a few times, "Hello? Anybody out here?" But my voice seemed to be swallowed by the dense woods, with no response. As I pushed through a particularly thick patch of underbrush, something caught my eye. A torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch. It looked like part of a jacket, the kind of high-performance outdoor gear that serious hikers wear. My pulse quickened as I moved closer, scanning the area for any more signs. That's when I heard it. A faint rustling, like someone or something was moving through the brush nearby. The sound was too deliberate to be the wind, too heavy to be a small animal.
"Dave!
I shouted, my voice echoing in the stillness.
Over here!"
I think I found something. I heard Dave's footsteps approaching rapidly. He burst through the undergrowth, his face set in a grim line. "What have you got, Harold?" he asked, slightly out of breath. "Look," I said, pointing to the scrap of fabric. "And listen, there's something moving out there." We stood still for a moment, straining our ears. The rustling came again, closer this time. Without a word, we began to push through the undergrowth, following the sounds. The forest seemed to grow darker around us, the trees pressing in closer. What we found was far worse than I'd imagined. Lying there, partially hidden by leaves and debris, was a body. It was a young woman, her face pale and lifeless, eyes staring blankly at the canopy above. There were deep gashes on her arms and legs, and her clothes were shredded. "Jesus," Dave muttered, his face pale. "What the hell happened here?" I knelt down to examine the body more closely, my years of wilderness first aid kicking in even though I knew it was too late. The wounds were unlike anything I'd seen before. Not the clean cuts of a knife, nor the tears from a fall. They looked almost animal, but no animal I knew could have done this. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we need to find the others." We radioed in our location and waited for the authorities to arrive. The rest of the day was a blur of questions. Crime scene tape and the grim task of searching for the other missing hikers. By nightfall, we had found 2 more bodies. Both men, both in similar states as the woman. As we made our way back to the ranger station that night, the forest felt different. The darkness between the trees seemed deeper, more menacing. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made us jump. Something had changed in our wilderness, and I had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning. The next few days were a whirlwind of investigation. The local sheriff's department was all over it, but they were as baffled as we were. No signs of animal attack, no clear motive, just a lot of unanswered questions and a growing sense of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. These weren't random killings. Whoever or whatever did this knew the area well. They had managed to overpower 3 adults, leaving no signs of a struggle beyond the immediate area where we found the bodies. It was then that I remembered something one of the older rangers, Hank Lawson, had told me when I first started. "Harold," he'd said, his eyes serious beneath his bushy eyebrows, "this place has a history. Weird things happen out here sometimes. People go missing, strange sightings. Some folks say there's something in these woods, something old and dangerous." At the time, I'd laughed it off, thinking it was just part of the park's folklore, meant to spook the new guy. But now, standing in the middle of a crime scene, Hank's words echoed in my mind. Over the next week, more search teams combed the area, but no new clues turned up. The murders became the talk of the town, with every local bar and diner buzzing with theories and rumors. Some said it was a rogue bear. Others whispered about escaped convicts or deranged hermits living in the woods. One night, after a long day of patrolling, Dave and I were sitting around the station, nursing beers and trying to make sense of it all. The mood was somber, the weight of recent events hanging heavy in the air. "You ever hear the old stories about these woods?" Dave asked suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked up from my beer, curious. "What stories?" Dave leaned in, his voice low. "Old-timers talk about something living in these parts. Something that's been here longer than any of us. They say it hunts in cycles, taking people every few decades." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to brush it off. "Come on, Dave. You don't believe in that kind of thing, do you?" He shrugged, but his eyes were serious. "I don't know what to believe anymore, Harold. But I've been thinking about those bodies, about the way they were mutilated. It wasn't like anything I've seen before. Yeah, I've heard the tales. Some kind of cannibal spirit, right?" I replied, half jokingly, trying to lighten the mood. Dave didn't smile. "Yeah, but what if it's not just a story? What if there's something out there we don't understand?" I sighed, feeling the weight of his words.
I don't know, man. I'm not one for ghost stories. But whatever it is, we need to find it before more people get hurt.
Little did I know then how prophetic those words would be, or how deeply our lives were about to change. The horrors we had witnessed were just the beginning of a nightmare that would push us to the very limits of our sanity and belief. As the investigation dragged on with no new leads, an uneasy quiet settled over the park. The tourists still came, drawn by the park's beauty, blissfully unaware of the dark events that had transpired. But for those of us who lived and worked there, the sense of dread never quite left. I found myself jumping at shadows, peering into the darkness between the trees, always feeling like something was watching me. My dreams were haunted by visions of mangled bodies and piercing, inhuman eyes glowing in the darkness. Weeks turned into months, and as winter approached, the case grew colder. The sheriff's department scaled back their presence, and life in the park slowly began to return to normal. But for Dave and me, things would never be the same. We took to patrolling together more often, watching each other's backs. Every noise in the forest, every unexplained track in the snow, set us on edge. We carried extra gear, including things we'd never thought we'd need in the park, like silver bullets Dave had specially made, inspired by old folklore. It was on one of these patrols, as the first real snow of the season began to fall, that everything changed again. We were checking some of the more remote trails, making sure no hikers had gotten stranded in the sudden cold snap. The forest was eerily beautiful in the snow, the white blanket muffling all sound. Our breath fogged in the air as we trudged through the deepening drifts. That's when I heard it, a sound so faint I almost missed it, a low rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat echoing through the trees. "Dave," I whispered, grabbing his arm, "you hear that?" He nodded, his face grim. Slowly we moved towards the sound, our hands on our weapons. As we pushed through a thick stand of pines, we came upon something that made my blood run cold. There, in a small clearing, stood an old cabin I'd never seen before. It looked ancient, the wood weathered and gray, with strange symbols carved into the doorframe. The thumping sound was coming from inside. Dave and I exchanged a look. We both knew this cabin shouldn't be here. We knew every structure in the park, and this definitely wasn't on any map. "Should we call for backup?" I whispered. Dave shook his head. "No time. If someone's in there, they could be hurt." Slowly we approached the cabin. The door hung askew on rusty hinges, creaking softly in the wind. The thumping had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I pushed the door open, wincing at the loud groan of the hinges. The interior of the cabin was dark, the air heavy with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic and sickly sweet. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw that the walls were covered in more of those strange symbols, carved deep into the wood. "What the hell is this place?" Dave muttered, his flashlight beam dancing across the room. I was about to respond when my light fell on something that made my heart stop. There in the corner was a trapdoor partially hidden under a tattered rug. The handle was moving ever so slightly up and down. Something was down there. Dave saw it too. Without a word, we both drew our weapons. I nodded to him, and he reached for the handle of the trap door. In one swift motion, he yanked it open, and we aimed our lights into the darkness below. What we saw in that cellar would haunt me for the rest of my days. It was like something out of a nightmare. The walls were lined with shelves, holding jars filled with parts, human parts. In the center of the room was a crude altar, covered in dark stains and surrounded by bones. But worst of all was the creature that crouched in the corner. It was vaguely human-shaped, but wrong in every way. Its skin was pale and mottled, stretched tight over an emaciated frame. Its eyes, when they turned to us, were black and soulless. For a moment we all froze. The creature, Dave and I, locked in a tableau of horror. Then, with a shriek that chilled me to my very core, the thing lunged at us. It moved with impossible speed, scrambling up the ladder towards us. "Run," I yelled, shoving Dave towards the door. We burst out of the cabin and into the snow, the creature's inhuman screams echoing behind us. I could hear it pursuing, its feet crunching in the snow, always just a few steps behind. We ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, the cold air burning in our lungs. I lost all sense of direction, driven only by the primal need to escape the horror that chased us. I don't know how long we ran, or how far. Eventually, we burst out onto one of the main trails, our legs giving out beneath us. We collapsed into the snow, gasping for breath, straining our ears for any sign of pursuit. But there was nothing. Just the quiet of the winter forest, and the sound of our ragged breathing. What was that thing? Dave panted, his face pale with shock and exertion. I shook my head, unable to form words. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. It defied everything I thought I knew about the world, about reality itself. We made our way back to the ranger station in a daze, jumping at every sound. When we finally reached safety, we called in everything. The sheriff, the state police, even the FBI. We told them about the cabin, the cellar, the creature. They searched, of course, every inch of the area where we said we'd found the cabin. But there was nothing there. No cabin, no cellar, no sign that anything had ever been there at all. Just pristine, unbroken snow. The official report cited hypothermia and snow blindness, suggesting that Dave and I had hallucinated the whole thing. But we knew what we saw. We knew it was real. In the years since that day, I've done a lot of research. I've dug into the history of the area, talked to locals, read every scrap of folklore I could find, and I've come to believe that what we encountered was something ancient, something that had been in those woods long before humans ever set foot there. The locals have names for it: the Wendigo, the Winter Watcher, the Hungry One. Every culture seems to have its own version of the story, but they all share the same core, a creature of insatiable hunger, of cold and darkness. I retired from the ranger service not long after that incident. I couldn't bear to be in those woods anymore. Always feeling watched, always waiting for that creature to return. Dave stuck it out a few years longer, but eventually he left too. The nightmares consoftussen I knew passer retractere, which other fisheries of five fault ply for palm, ren versor nu try from war. Dave stuck it out a few years longer, but eventually he left too. The nightmares were too much for both of us. We still keep in touch, bound by the shared horror of what we experienced that day. But leaving didn't end it. Not really. Because sometimes, on cold winter nights when the wind howls outside my window, I can still hear that inhuman shriek. And I know deep in my bones that somewhere out there in the vast wilderness of Baxter State Park, that thing is still hunting. It was about 5 years after the incident when I got the call from Dave. His voice was tense, urgent. "Harold," he said, "it's happening again." My blood ran cold. I knew instantly what he meant. "Where?" "Not far from where we saw it. 3 hikers missing. Search parties found." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "They found remains, just like before." I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. The memories I'd tried so hard to suppress came flooding back. The mangled bodies, the dark cellar, those soulless eyes. "What do you want me to do, Dave?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "I need your help, Harold. Nobody else knows what we're really dealing with. We have to stop it this time." I wanted to say no. I wanted to hang up the phone and pretend this wasn't happening, but I knew I couldn't. Whatever that thing was, it was my responsibility. Our responsibility. I'll be there tomorrow, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The drive back to Baxter State Park was surreal. As the familiar landscape rolled by, memories both good and terrible flashed through my mind. The pristine wilderness that had once been my sanctuary now felt like a mask, hiding something dark and hungry beneath its beauty. Dave met me at the ranger station. He looked older, more haggard than I remembered. The years hadn't been kind to either of us. "Thanks for coming," he said, clasping my hand firmly. "I wasn't sure you would." I nodded grimly. "Had to. What's the situation?" Dave led me inside, where maps and photos were spread across a large table. 3 hikers went missing 4 days ago. 2 men and a woman, all in their 30s. Experienced outdoors people, not the type to get lost easily. He pointed to a spot on the map. "We found the first body here, about 2 miles from the Chimney Pond Trail. What was left of it anyway." I swallowed hard, forcing down the bile rising in my throat. "And the others?" Dave shook his head. "Nothing yet, but we found this." He handed me a photo. It showed a tree with deep gouges in its bark, forming a symbol I recognized from the cabin we'd found years ago. "It's marking its territory," I muttered. Dave nodded. "That's what I thought too. Harold, we can't let the search parties go in there unprepared. They don't know what they're dealing with." I looked at him, seeing the fear and determination in his eyes. "What's your plan?" "We go in ourselves. Tonight. We know what to look for, how to track it. And this time," he paused, pulling out a small wooden box. "We're prepared." He opened the box, revealing a collection of strange items. Silver bullets, vials of what looked like holy water, bundles of herbs, and a pair of ancient-looking daggers. I raised an eyebrow. "Been doing some research?" Dave's face was grim. "Every spare moment since that day. I've talked to tribal elders, cryptozoologists, occult experts. These are our best bets for fighting that thing." Part of me wanted to laugh, to dismiss it all as superstition. But I'd seen too much to disbelieve. I picked up one of the daggers, feeling its weight in my hand. "All right," I said. "Let's go hunting." As night fell, Dave and I set out into the darkening forest. The familiar trails now felt ominous, every shadow potentially hiding our nightmarish quarry. We moved silently, our senses hyper-alert for any sign of the creature. Hours passed as we trekked deeper into the wilderness. The moon rose, casting an eerie glow through the trees. That's when we heard it, a low guttural sound that was neither human nor animal. Dave and I froze, exchanging a look of mingled fear and determination. Slowly, we crept towards the source of the sound. As we pushed through a dense thicket, we came upon a clearing bathed in moonlight. There, in the center of the clearing, stood the creature. It was just as horrifying as I remembered. Pale, emaciated, with those black, soulless eyes. But now, in the moonlight, I could see more details that my mind had mercifully blurred before. Its fingers ended in long, cruel claws. Its mouth, when it opened in a silent snarl, was filled with needle-sharp teeth. At its feet lay a body, one of the missing hikers. The creature crouched over its prey, ready to feed. Without thinking, I stepped forward, raising my weapon. A twig snapped under my foot, and the creature's head whipped around, its eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a shriek that split the night, the creature lunged at us. What followed was a battle unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The creature moved with impossible speed and strength, its claws slashing through the air inches from our faces. Dave and I fought back with everything we had, firing silver bullets, slashing with the ancient daggers. But nothing seemed to slow it down. Our weapons, for all Dave's research, seemed to have little effect. As we fought, I began to realize the terrible truth. We were outmatched. This thing, whatever it was beyond our ability to fight. Just as despair began to overtake me, I remembered something. A detail from the old stories that Dave had shared during our research. According to legend, these creatures, these Wendigos, were once human. They became monsters through acts of cannibalism, their humanity twisted by desperation and hunger. In that moment, I made a desperate gamble. I lowered my weapon and stepped forward, looking directly into those terrifying eyes. We know what you are, I said, my voice shaking but growing stronger. We know you were human once. You don't have to be this thing. The creature paused, tilting its head as if confused. I pressed on, hoping against hope that some shred of humanity remained in this monster. There's still a choice. You can stop this. Let go of the hunger. Remember who you were. For a long moment, nothing happened. The creature stood motionless, its black eyes boring into mine. Then, slowly, something changed. The eyes began to clear, the monstrous features to soften. Before our astonished eyes, the creature began to transform. The pale, stretched skin regained color. The claws retracted into normal fingers. And there, where the monster had stood, was a man, gaunt, wild-eyed, but undeniably human. He fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Help me," he whispered, his voice hoarse from years of inhuman screams. Dave and I approached cautiously, still hardly believing what we'd seen. As the man looked up at us, I recognized him from old missing persons reports, a hiker who had disappeared in these woods nearly 50 years ago. We brought him back to civilization, where he told a tale almost too horrific to believe. He had become lost in the woods, starving and desperate. In his madness, he had resorted to cannibalism, feeding on the body of his dead hiking companion. That act had transformed him into the creature we encountered, cursed to roam the woods, always hungry, always hunting. The authorities didn't believe his story, of course. He was charged with the recent murders, his confession seen as the ramblings of a deranged killer. Dave and I knew the truth, but who would believe us? In the years since that night, I've often wondered if we truly defeated the evil in those woods, or if we merely changed its form. The murders stopped, yes. But sometimes, when I look at the news and see the countless acts of human cruelty, I can't help but think that the real monsters were always among us, wearing human faces. I still live near Baxter State Park. Some might call me foolish, staying so close to the site of such horrors. But I feel a responsibility to watch, to guard against the darkness I know lurks in those woods. And deep down, I know that if that evil should ever rise again, I'll be ready. Because once you've seen behind the veil of our world, once you've confronted the impossible and survived, you can never truly go back. You can only go forward, carrying the weight of that knowledge, and hope that when the time comes, you'll have the strength to face the darkness once more. So if you find yourself in the wilds of Maine, hiking the beautiful trails of Baxter State Park, remember this story. Remember that sometimes the greatest dangers aren't the ones we can see. And if you hear something moving in the woods, something that sounds almost but not quite human, run, and don't look back. Because in this world, there are things that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows of our rational, orderly lives. And sometimes, just sometimes, those things get hungry. The years following our encounter with the Wendigo-turned-man were filled with a strange mix of relief and unease. While the immediate threat seemed to have passed, the knowledge of what lurked in the shadows of our world never truly left me. I found myself unable to fully return to my old life, always watching, always waiting for signs that the darkness might be stirring again. I took a job as a consultant for the Park Service, using my experience to help train new rangers in wilderness survival and search and rescue techniques. Of course, I never mentioned the true horrors I'd encountered. Who would believe me? Instead, I focused on practical skills, all the while keeping a watchful eye on any unusual occurrences in the park. Dave, on the other hand, threw himself into research. He traveled the country, even venturing abroad, seeking out stories of similar creatures and the lore surrounding them. We kept in touch, sharing what we learned and supporting each other through the nightmares that still plagued us both. It was on a crisp autumn evening, almost a decade after our last encounter with the Wendigo, that everything changed again. I was sitting on my porch, watching the sun set over the distant peaks of Baxter State Park, when my phone rang. It was Dave, and from the moment I heard his voice, I knew something was wrong. "Harold," he said, his voice tight with tension. "I need you to come to the ranger station, now." "What's going on, Dave?" I asked, already reaching for my coat. "I can't explain over the phone. Just get here as fast as you can." The drive to the ranger station was tense, my mind racing with possibilities. Had there been more disappearances? Had the Wendigo returned? As I pulled into the parking lot, I saw Dave waiting for me outside, pacing nervously. "Thank God you're here," he said as I approached. Come on, there's something you need to see. He led me into the station and straight to the communications room. A young ranger I didn't recognize was sitting at the radio, her face pale and drawn. Dave nodded to her, and she pressed a button on the console. A burst of static filled the room, followed by a voice that made my blood run cold. It was distorted, barely human, but the words were clear enough. The hunger, it's awakening. The old ones stir. Baxter will fall. The message repeated once more before dissolving into static. I looked at Dave, seeing my own horror reflected in his eyes. When did this come in? I asked. About an hour ago, Dave replied. We've been trying to trace it, but what? Dave hesitated, then said, the signal, it's coming from inside the park, from a location that doesn't exist. I felt a chill run down my spine. The cabin, I whispered. Dave nodded grimly. That's what I thought too. Harold, I think it's starting again. But this time it's bigger than just one Wendigo. Over the next few days, reports began to trickle in from all over the park. Hikers describing strange sounds in the night. Rangers finding bizarre tracks that didn't match any known animal. And most disturbing of all, sightings of pale, emaciated figures moving through the trees at impossible speeds. The park authorities were at a loss. They increased patrols, issued warnings to visitors, but Dave and I knew these measures wouldn't be enough. Whatever was awakening in the depths of Baxter State Park was beyond their understanding or capability to handle. We knew we had to act, but we also knew we couldn't do it alone. Drawing on Dave's years of research and my own connections in the Ranger Service, we began to assemble a team. It was a strange group, a mix of seasoned wilderness experts, occult researchers, and a few individuals who, like us, had encountered things that defied explanation and lived to tell the tale. Among them was Sarah Redfeather, a member of the local Penobscot tribe who had grown up hearing the old stories of Wendigos and other forest spirits. There was also Dr. Elena Vasquez, a cryptozoologist who had spent years studying legends of humanoid creatures from around the world. Rounding out our core team was Jack Harper, a former Special Forces operator who had encountered something unexplainable during a mission in the remote mountains of Afghanistan and had been seeking answers ever since. As we prepared for what we knew would be a dangerous expedition into the heart of the park, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were embarking on something that would change us all forever. The stakes were higher than ever before. It wasn't just about saving a few hikers now. It felt like we were standing on the precipice of a battle for the very soul of the wilderness. Our plan was to enter the park under the guise of a standard search and rescue operation. We would make our way to the last known location of the radio signal, near where Dave and I had encountered the Wendigo years before. From there, we would attempt to locate the source of the disturbance and, well, we weren't entirely sure what we'd do then. Stop it somehow. We had to. The night before we were set to leave, I found myself unable to sleep. I stood at my window, looking out at the dark silhouette of the mountains against the star-filled sky. In the distance, I thought I heard a faint, inhuman cry carried on the wind. A shiver ran through me as I realized that somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness I had once called home, an ancient evil was awakening, and we were the only ones who could stop it. As dawn broke, our team gathered at the ranger station. The atmosphere was tense, each of us acutely aware of the dangers we were about to face. We checked our gear one last time, a mix of standard wilderness equipment and more esoteric items that Sarah and Dr. Vasquez had insisted we bring. We set out just as the sun was rising, the morning mist still clinging to the trees. The forest seemed different now, charged with an energy I couldn't quite explain. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves set us on edge. For the first day, our journey was uneventful. We made good time, pushing deeper into the park than most search parties would dare to go. As night fell, we made camp in a small clearing, setting up a perimeter of protective wards under Sarah's guidance. It was in the deep hours of the night that we heard it, a sound that jolted us all awake. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, a mix of a wolf's howl and a human scream, but twisted into something utterly wrong. Jack was on his feet in an instant, rifle at the ready. Dr. Vasquez fumbled for her recording equipment, her scientific curiosity overriding her fear. It's starting, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. The veil between worlds is thinning. The next morning we broke camp early, all of us eager to be on the move. As we hiked, the forest around us seemed to change. The trees grew denser, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The underbrush became thicker, as if the forest itself was trying to impede our progress. By midday, we had reached the area where Dave and I had encountered the Wendigo years before. The clearing where we had found the cabin was empty now, showing no signs that anything had ever been there. But as we stood there, I felt a sense of wrongness that made my skin crawl. "Look," Jack said suddenly, pointing to a nearby tree. Carved into the bark was a symbol, the same one we had seen years ago in the cabin. Dr. Vasquez approached it cautiously, her hand hovering over the carving. "It's fresh," she said. "Couldn't be more than a day old." As if on cue, another inhuman cry echoed through the forest, closer this time. We all tensed, weapons at the ready. "We need to keep moving," Dave said, his voice tight with tension. "Whatever's out there, it knows we're here now." We pressed on, following a trail that seemed to appear and disappear at will. The further we went, the more the forest seemed to change around us. The colors became muted, the air grew colder, and an unnatural mist began to rise from the ground. It was late afternoon when we found the cave. Hidden behind a curtain of vines, it would have been easy to miss if Sarah hadn't sensed its presence. The entrance was dark and foreboding, ancient symbols carved into the rock around it. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice filled with a mix of fear and awe. "The source of the disturbance, the place where the veil is thinnest." We stood there for a moment, each of us wrestling with our own fears and doubts. We had come this far, but what awaited us in the darkness beyond was beyond anything we had prepared for. "We don't have to do this," I said, looking at each member of our team. "Anyone who wants to turn back, now's the time." But no one moved. We had all come too far, seen too much to turn back now. With a nod to each other, we lit our lanterns and stepped into the cave. The air inside was cold and damp, heavy with the scent of decay. Our lights cast long shadows on the walls, revealing more of the strange symbols we had seen outside. As we moved deeper into the cave, the symbols began to glow with a faint, sickly light. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning deeper into the earth. Just as I was beginning to wonder if we had made a terrible mistake, the passage widened into a vast cavern. What we saw there defied explanation. In the center of the cavern was a pool of inky black liquid, its surface rippling with an otherworldly energy. Surrounding the pool were standing stones, each carved with the same symbols we had seen throughout our journey. But it was what stood beyond the pool that truly chilled me to my core. There, emerging from the shadows, were figures, dozens of them. They were like the Wendigo we had encountered years ago, but different. Each was unique in its horror, as if they represented every dark legend, every nightmare creature from the depths of human fear. At the head of this nightmarish gathering stood a figure that could only be their leader. It was massive, easily twice the size of a man, with antlers that scraped the ceiling of the cavern. Its eyes glowed with an unholy light, fixing us with a gaze that seemed to pierce our very souls. "Welcome," it said, its voice a deep rumble that shook the very ground beneath our feet. "We have been waiting for you." In that moment, I realized the true nature of what we faced. This wasn't just about one Wendigo or even a group of them. This was something far older, far more terrible. We stood at the threshold between our world and something else, something that had been waiting countless ages to break through. What followed was a battle unlike anything I could have imagined. Each member of our team fought with everything they had: Jack's military training, Sarah's ancient knowledge, Dr. Vasquez's scientific ingenuity. All of it came into play as we fought against the horde of nightmarish creatures. I found myself facing the leader, the ancient Wendigo that seemed to embody all the hunger and darkness of the forest. As we fought, I realized that this creature was connected to the land itself, drawing power from the very roots of the mountains. The battle raged on, seeming to last both an eternity and no time at all. We were outnumbered, outmatched, but we fought on, driven by the knowledge that if we fell, there would be nothing standing between these horrors and the unsuspecting world beyond. Just when all seemed lost, when our strength was failing and the darkness seemed poised to overwhelm us, I remembered something. The words I had spoken years ago to the Wendigo we had encountered, the spark of humanity that had remained even in the depths of its monstrosity. With the last of my strength, I stood before the ancient Wendigo and spoke, my voice ringing out above the chaos of the battle. This isn't who you are, I said, looking directly into its glowing eyes. You were guardians once, protectors of the land. You've forgotten your true purpose. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The Wendigo leader tilted its head, as if hearing something long forgotten. Remember, I continued, my voice growing stronger. Remember the balance you once maintained. The forest doesn't need your hunger. It needs your protection. A change came over the Wendigo's face, a flicker of recognition in its ancient eyes. And in that moment I understood. These creatures hadn't always been monsters. They had been twisted, corrupted by time and forgotten purpose into the horrors we now faced. With a roar that shook the cavern, the Wendigo leader turned to its followers. It spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but the effect was immediate. The attacking creatures fell back, their forms shifting and changing. Before our astonished eyes, the Wendigos began to transform. The monstrous features melted away, replaced by forms that were still inhuman but no longer nightmarish. They became creatures of the forest, not fully animal, not fully spirit, but something in between. The leader turned back to me, its form now that of a majestic elk-like creature, wisdom and age evident in its eyes. You have reminded us of what we once were, it said, its voice now a gentle whisper rather than an earth-shaking rumble. For too long we lost ourselves to the hunger, forgot our true purpose. We thank you for awakening us. With those words, the creatures began to fade, becoming one with the forest around us. The oppressive atmosphere of the cavern lifted, the symbols on the walls dimming and then disappearing altogether. As the last of the creatures vanished, we stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. We had come expecting to fight a great evil, only to find that the true battle was one of remembrance and redemption. Slowly we made our way back to the surface. As we emerged from the cave, we found that the forest had changed once again. Gone was the oppressive, twisted landscape we had traversed. In its place was the Baxter State Park we knew and loved, vibrant with life and natural beauty. In the days that followed, we struggled to come to terms with what we had experienced. The park authorities predictably dismissed our story as the ravings of a team that had gotten lost and succumbed to hallucinations. But we knew the truth. As for me, I found a new purpose. I dedicated myself to protecting the balance we had helped restore. I became a voice for conservation, working to ensure that the wilderness of Baxter State Park remained unspoiled. Dave continued his research, but with a new focus. He sought to understand the ancient guardians we had encountered, to ensure that their true nature was never forgotten again. Sarah returned to her tribe, sharing the wisdom we had gained and working to revive old traditions that honored the spirit of the land. Dr. Vasquez wrote a series of papers that, while dismissed by much of the scientific community, sparked a new interest in the study of folklore and its connection to ecology. And Jack? He found a peace he had been seeking since his experiences in Afghanistan. He became a wilderness guide, helping others connect with the healing power of nature. As for the Wendigos, we never saw them again. At least, not in their monstrous form. But sometimes, on quiet nights in the deepest parts of the forest, visitors to the park report seeing magnificent creatures moving through the trees, ancient and wise, watching over the land with vigilant eyes. The story of our encounter in Baxter State Park may never be widely believed, but for those of us who were there, who stood at the threshold between worlds and helped restore an ancient balance, the experience changed us forever. So if you find yourself in the wilds of Maine, remember this tale. Remember that the forest is alive in ways we may never fully understand. And if you listen closely on a quiet night, you might just hear the whisper of ancient guardians, keeping watch over the land they once forgot, but now protect once more. For in the end we learned that the greatest monsters are not those that lurk in the shadows, but the ones we create when we forget our connection to the natural world. And sometimes the most powerful act is not to fight, but to remember, to remind and to restore what was lost. As I sit here now, years later, looking out over the peaks of Baxter State Park, I feel a deep sense of peace. The forest has its guardians once more, and though the world may never know the full truth of what happened in those dark days, I know that the balance has been restored, and in that knowledge I find comfort. For as long as there are those who remember, who respect the old ways and the spirits of the land, the darkness will never fully return. The hunger will remain at bay, and the Wendigos will continue their ancient vigil, not as monsters, but as protectors of the wild places that still exist in our world. So ends my tale. A story of horror turned to hope, of ancient evils redeemed, and of the enduring power of memory and connection. May it serve as a reminder to all who hear it. The wilderness is vast and mysterious, filled with wonders and terrors beyond our understanding. But if we approach it with respect, with open hearts and minds, we may find that the greatest adventures, the most profound transformations await us in the depths of the forest. And who knows? Perhaps one day, if you're very lucky, you might catch a glimpse of a Wendigo in its true form, a majestic guardian of the wild, watching over the land with ancient eyes. And in that moment, you'll know that the balance, The air hung heavy and still as I stepped out of my truck and hefted my backpack over my shoulders. Another routine backcountry patrol as a ranger in the remote Alaskan wilderness. But something felt off today. An uneasiness I couldn't quite place as I locked the vehicle and set off down the narrow trail. Tall pines rose up on either side, their branches knitting together overhead to cast the forest floor in deep shadow despite the midday sun. The familiar chirps and chitters of wildlife seemed strangely muted, the usual signs of the thriving ecosystem subdued. As I hiked deeper into the trees, a tingle crept up my spine, the uncanny sensation of being watched prickling at the back of my neck. I paused, scanning the dense foliage around me for any sign of the cougar or bear that might be stalking me. But the woods were utterly still, not even a breeze to stir the leaves. With a shake of my head, I pressed onward. 5 years spent patrolling this wilderness had left me too prone to imagining threats lurking behind every tree. The winding path led me deeper into the forest's hushed heart. A few times, I caught a flicker of motion out the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing, just the endless green of ferns and moss and ancient gnarled trunks. The back of my neck continued to prickle nonetheless. After a couple of uneventful hours picking my way over fallen logs and around boulders, I stopped in a small clearing to consult my map, the edges curling beneath my fingers. The narrow valley I was aiming for should have been visible through the trees by now. I frowned and peered at the faded contour lines crisscrossing the weathered paper. A rookie mistake, but it seemed I had taken a wrong turn at some point. With a sigh, I folded the map into a neat square and tucked it away, then unslung my pack to retrieve my sat phone and GPS unit. But as I reached for the devices, my fingers brushed something soft and yielding. Startled, I yanked my hand back as if burned. Heart pounding, I peered into the pack's shadowy depths. There, nestled amongst the coils of climbing rope and neatly folded emergency blanket, was a small rag doll, fashioned from what looked like moose hide, with bits of fur and feather tied in a miniature braid. It resembled the old tribal totems I had seen sold in the tourist gift shops, but I knew with absolute certainty it wasn't mine. Ice threaded through my veins as I gingerly lifted the doll out, half expecting it to turn its button eyes to meet mine. It remained motionless, but the sense of unease ratcheted up sharply. Someone or something had placed this in my pack, and that meant I was being followed by more than my imagination. Unnerved, I swept my gaze over the clearing, searching for any sign of my stalker, but the looming trees kept their secrets, and no telltale rustling of undergrowth or snapping of twigs betrayed a watcher in the shadows. Swallowing hard, I shoved the doll into my pocket, out of sight but not out of mind, and returned to the trail with a renewed wariness in my steps and a tightness in my chest. What trouble had I stumbled into? The next hour of hiking did nothing to lift the shroud of apprehension weighing heavily on my shoulders. I found myself jumping at every snapped twig, every distant bird call, my eyes constantly roving the shifting latticework of light and shadow that dappled the forest floor. Distracted, I nearly stumbled over a half-buried log, catching myself at the last moment with a muttered curse. Straightening, I scanned the area again, feeling increasingly hemmed in by the towering trunks and dense foliage on all sides. Then, in a shaft of sunlight breaking through the canopy's green roof, something caught my eye. A line of tracks pressed into a patch of mud just off the narrow trail. Frowning, I knelt to examine them more closely. At first glance, they resembled bear tracks. The long curved toes and heavy pad were distinctive even to my untrained eye. But as I looked closer, a shiver prickled down my spine. The prints were too elongated, too narrow to be from any bear I'd ever encountered in my years patrolling these woods. And at the heel, instead of the expected round impression, 5 gashes scored the mud like the clawed fingers of some monstrous hand. I swallowed, mouth gone suddenly dry as I stared at those unnatural prints. No animal I knew of could have left them. Rising on shaky legs, I swept my gaze over the silent forest, searching for any other sign of the creature's passage. But the tracks seemed to vanish after a few paces, and no broken branches or disturbed undergrowth hinted at which way it had gone. "Hello?" I called hesitantly, my voice disappearing into the hush without even an echo. There was no answer save the distant caw of a crow. Unsettled, I looked down at the bizarre prints again, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Then, from somewhere off to my left, came the unmistakable crack of a branch snapping, as deliberate as a gunshot in the stillness. I spun toward the sound, my heart leaping into my throat as I scanned the shadows between the trees. But I saw nothing, no flicker of movement, no looming shape in the undergrowth. Uneasiness hardening into true fear, I took a step back, my hand tightening on the straps of my backpack. The forest suddenly felt too tight, too watchful, the very air charged with unseen menace. A hoarse shout made me nearly jump out of my skin. An old man stood on the trail a short distance away, leaning on a gnarled walking stick and regarding me from beneath a battered felt hat. His weathered face was as craggy and lined as the ponderosa pines rising around us, his eyes glittering like chips of obsidian. "Easy there," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Didn't mean to startle you." My heart still racing. I managed a stiff nod. "You live around here?" I asked, striving to keep my tone casual. It wasn't unheard of for dedicated outdoorsmen to make their homes in these wilds. But something about this old-timer raised the hairs on my arms. A shadow passed behind his eyes. In a manner of speaking, he looked past me, to the strange tracks marring the mud, and his lips thinned. "You'd best be careful, Ranger. There's things in these woods that don't take kindly to visitors." A chill washed through me at his words. "What kind of things?" The old man shook his head slowly. "Pray you don't find out." He straightened, faded flannel shirt pulling tight over a bony shoulder. "Leave this place. Don't look back." Then, with no more than a parting nod, he turned and limped away, vanishing into the trees as suddenly as he had appeared. For a long moment I stood frozen, staring after him and trying to convince myself he'd been nothing more than a product of my overactive nerves. But I couldn't shake the chill his cryptic warning had sent through me. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I looked around one last time, searching for any hint of the strange presence that had dogged my steps all afternoon. There a flicker of motion drew my gaze to a screen of dense brush 30 yards away. A face peered back at me from the shadows, as still and watchful as a wolf. But it was no wolf, nor any creature I recognized. Bile rose in the back of my throat as I stared into that terrible visage. It was like someone had taken the features of a man and an animal and stitched them together into an abomination. A lumpy brow, pointed ears, a flash of yellowed fangs in a lipless mouth. Then it was gone, melting away into the foliage between one blink and the next, so swiftly I half convinced myself it had been a trick of the light. But I knew better. The glimpse of that twisted parody of life had shaken me to my core, stoking my growing conviction that something was deeply, hideously wrong in this forest. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to flee these shadow-haunted woods before I became the next victim of whatever nightmares lurked here. Instead, I pressed onward with leaden steps, dread coiling ever tighter in my gut. I was a ranger, sworn to protect this wilderness and the people who ventured into it. And that meant confronting this faceless stalker, no matter how badly I wanted to run. But as the trees closed in around me once more, I couldn't shake the cold certainty that I was walking into a horror I couldn't begin to fathom. Dusky fingers of twilight slowly stole the color from the forest as afternoon bled into evening. Overhead, the sky darkened to a brooding cobalt blue behind skeletal branches. Soon only a pale orange glow remained along the western horizon, the sun's dying rays clinging tenuously to a world being swiftly swallowed by shadow. A grim urgency hastened my steps as the encroaching dark sharpened every sound and scent. The rhythmic crunch of my boots against the forest loam sounded far too loud, and the salty tang of my own fear-drenched sweat filled my nostrils. Unbidden, my hand crept to the canister of bear spray at my belt, as if the potent irritant could do anything against the creature stalking me. As full night settled over the woods, strange sounds joined the chorus of crickets and frogs from the lightless depths, sounds that sent fresh ice trickling down my spine. A throaty chuffing, like a great cat prowling just out of sight. The deliberate snap of dead wood circling, herding me onward. And beneath it all, a queasy susurrus that might have been the breeze through the trees or distant half-heard voices gibbering in a language never meant for human tongues. At some point I fumbled my flashlight out of my pack, the feeble beam illuminating a narrow path between the endless rows of tree trunks, but the darkness thickened around that pitiful circle of light, gaining substance until it felt as if I was wading through ink. I had hiked these forests at night 100 times, but never had the black felt so alive, so malevolent. I could almost feel it prowling at my heels, nipping at my ankles as I stumbled through the bracken. Every instinct screamed to break into a blind run, but the certainty of what would happen if I lost the trail kept me grinding forward at a determined march. Sooner or later I would have to stop and make camp for the night. The thought of lying helpless in this haunted wood, with only the flimsy nylon of my tent between me and whatever lurked in the shadows, sent a fresh surge of dread pulsing through my veins. At long last I burst from the tree line onto the rocky bank of a small stream. Even the feeble starlight filtering through the canopy seemed blinding after so long in the Stygian forest. I collapsed to my knees at the water's edge, splashing my face with shaking hands. The icy liquid shocked a small measure of clarity back into my faltering senses. I wasn't lost, not yet. If I followed the stream northwest, I would eventually reach the ranger outpost that was my destination. All I had to do was make it through the night without losing my nerve or my life. With a concerted effort, I forced down the panic trying to claw its way up my throat. As I knelt there trying to gather the tattered scraps of my courage, a gleam of pale cloth caught my eye. A short distance downstream, even before my flashlight beam fell on it, I knew it was no ordinary piece of litter. The beam threw into sharp relief a torn, stained hiking boot, caught on a sandbar in the middle of the stream. My mouth went bone dry as I played the light along the opposite bank. Just visible in the patchy illumination were the splintered remains of walking poles, tatters of a coated nylon jacket, and an overturned backpack with its contents strewn across the gravel. There was an almost staged quality to the tableau, as if the items had been placed deliberately to lure me closer. And there, half buried in the silt, a human femur, picked clean of flesh and glistening wetly in the faltering beam. I recoiled so sharply I nearly toppled backward into the water, a choked cry tearing from my throat. Wildly I swung the flashlight beam in an arc, certain I would see the creature crouched on the bank, grinning at me with that rictus of jagged fangs. But the night showed me nothing save dancing shadows and the pale bone winking at me from the stream bed. Someone else had walked this path before me, I realized in a numb daze, and they had met a grisly end at the hands of my faceless stalker. The old man's warning echoed in my ears. There's things in these woods that don't take kindly to visitors. I had laughed it off as local superstition. Now I was face to face with the horrifying truth of it. I needed to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between myself and this grim scene, but my legs seemed to have turned to lead, my feet rooted to the rocky ground. Some animal instinct warned that if I tried to run, the chase would begin in earnest. And this time, there would be no escape. With an effort that left me trembling, I forced myself to turn my back on that macabre pile of remains. Numb, I slogged away from the stream, back into the anonymous bulk of the forest. I had no destination now, save away from the creature, away from the grinning skull and splintered bones of the hiker who'd come before. But there was no away to be found in this shadow-haunted wilderness. I could only forge onward into the waiting gullet of the night, knowing in my bones that it was a beast that would swallow me whole. Setting up camp with trembling hands and a mind clouded by exhaustion and fear was an exercise in grim determination. The uncaring stars watched through a sparse latticework of pine boughs as I cleared a small area, erected my tent, and built a hasty fire from deadfall. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every sigh of wind through the canopy, ratcheted my nerves tighter. I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes boring into my back from the blackness beyond the fire's feeble light. Hunkered on a fallen log, I forced down a few bites of an energy bar, tasteless wax coating my tongue. My appetite had vanished along with the sun. The dark felt too thick, too watchful, an unseen pressure squeezing the breath from my lungs. All I wanted was to crawl into my tent and pull the flap tight against the night's menace. But I knew sleep would be a long time coming. To calm my jumping thoughts, I retrieved my satellite phone from my pack, intending to thumb through the scant collection of books loaded on its memory card. But as I dug through the main compartment, a cold knot of dread formed in the pit of my stomach. The phone was gone from its usual pocket, along with the spare batteries and solar charger. Even the emergency flares I always carried had vanished. Only the strange little fetish doll remained, its button eyes glinting in the firelight. Icy sweat prickled along my hairline as I checked the rest of the pack with increasing desperation. My topo maps, GPS unit, compass, all gone, along with half my food rations. There was no question what had happened. At some point during my harrowing flight through the darkening woods, the creature had crept close enough to filch the items, so swiftly and silently I never noticed. The teasing parody of the fetish left behind told me it was no accident. The thing was toying with me, I realized. Goose flesh rippling along my arms, stripping away anything that might help me escape or call for aid, until I was utterly at its mercy. A mouse being batted between the paws of a cat, allowed to scramble so its struggles might be all the more piquant when the final pounce came. A sudden rush of movement in the underbrush jolted me to my feet, heart hammering against my ribs. I snatched up a half-burnt branch from the fire as I peered wildly into the night. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Show yourself." Silence, save for the forlorn hoot of an owl somewhere in the distance. Even the crickets and frogs had fallen still. Then, drifting from the darkness like a curl of smoke, "Randall!" A strangled gasp tore from my throat. It was Jen's voice, my wife's voice, achingly familiar after so many long shifts apart. But there was something horribly wrong with it, a guttural resonance that scraped along my spine like a blade. "Randall, I'm so cold." A rustle of undergrowth, circling the edges of the wavering firelight. "Why did you leave me alone out here?" "No," I choked out, clenching the branch until my knuckles went white. It couldn't be her. Jen was safe at home, 100 miles away. This was some cruel trick, my mind rebelling against the night's horrors. But oh, it sounded so much like her. The lilting cadence, the gentle concern, beneath the grating distortion, like a record played at the wrong speed. "Please, I need you." A shadow detached from the tree line, the vague outline of a figure in the dark. "Come to me." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the stones ringing the fire. "Stay away." My voice emerged as a strangled croak. "You're not her. You're not real." A chilling laugh emanated from the murk. No longer my wife's dulcet tones, but a rasping growl that sent spikes of ice down my spine. "Oh, I'm real enough, little mouse. And we have such games to play, you and I." Leaves rustled on all sides now, the night coming alive with spectral motion. Tall shapes slipped between the endless columns of pine trunks, lithe and predatory, and from the depths of the forest rose a susurration of whispers that might have been the wind in the branches, or a chorus of damned souls. "Randall, Randall." My name repeated over and over in a sibilant parody of Jen's honeyed lilt, layered and echoing until it filled my head, my heart, driving out all other thought. Helpless, I clapped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to block the rising cacophony. The terror of it drove me to my knees, the firebrand tumbling from my numb fingers. "Randall, my love. Come play, come play. Never leave. Stay and play. And play." A shudder racked my frame as those insidious whispers twined through my mind. I had to get away, I realized dimly through the haze of fear. Away from the glutting shadows, the warped siren call of my wife's voice. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Not from the twisted things that crept and crawled and slithered between the watching trees. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the chorus cut off, plunging the night back into ringing silence. I lifted my head, hardly daring to breathe as I scanned the Stygian woods. No sign of the shadowy figures, no flicker of motion in the underbrush. Even the crushing sense of unseen regard boring into my back had lifted. For a wild, fleeting moment, I thought perhaps it was over, that the nightmare had released me from its grasp. But as I staggered upright on watery legs, I caught a glint of mocking intelligence in the firelight. There on the fallen log where I had made my meager camp, a pair of eyes stared back at me. Not the button eyes of the fetish doll, but real eyes, human eyes, wide and glassy and utterly lifeless. It was the old man from the trail, his seamed face frozen in a rictus of terror, mouth yawning in a silent scream. He was propped on the log like a ventriloquist dummy, limbs splayed at unnatural angles, but that wasn't the worst of it. His skin was gone. flayed from his body in ragged strips until nothing remained but glistening red muscle and yellow gobbets of fat. A wet, meaty mass like an anatomical sketch made nightmarishly real. As I stared in mute horror, a fly crawled lazily over the ruin of his cheek and vanished into the black socket of an eye. The scream that ripped from my throat seemed to come from a great distance, muffled by the roaring of blood in my ears. I screamed and screamed until my voice gave out, until there was nothing left but a thin animal keening. And through it all, those sightless eyes stared into mine, twin pools of judgment and damnation. "This is your fate," they seemed to say. "This is what waits for you, in the belly of the night." The thought jolted through me like a lightning strike, galvanizing my locked limbs into sudden panicked motion. Heedless of direction, I plunged into the woods, leaving my pack, my tent, the gruesome remains of the old man behind. The night swallowed me at once, trees flashing past on either side, undergrowth snatching at my ankles. Headlong I crashed through the brush, hurtled over fallen logs, fled blindly into the labyrinth of the forest. But even as I ran, the cold certainty settled in my gut that there would be no escape. The fetid breath of my pursuer billowed at the nape of my neck, its delighted laughter nipping at my heels. I had gazed upon the face of true darkness, and it would never let me go. Brambles tore at my face and arms as I plunged through a screen of brush, staggering into a small clearing. My legs felt like jelly, my pulse a wild tattoo in my throat. I couldn't keep running, couldn't draw a full breath past the iron band constricting my chest. In a haze of exhaustion and fear, I slumped against a gnarled trunk and cast a bleary eye over the pre-dawn gloom. Endless ranks of pines encircled me, the ground between choked with dense undergrowth, blackberries, elderberries, salal. The light was stronger here, away from the forest's inky depths, but it only sharpened the savage lines of the wilderness hemming me in. No sign of my camp, or even the stream. My mad sprint had been too wild, too chaotic for me to retrace my steps. And I was being hunted. There could be no doubt of it now. Every hair on my arms stood erect, an electric crackle racing down my spine as I listened for sounds of pursuit, stealthy footfalls in the ferns, a branch swaying against the breeze, that rasping, gloating voice reaching out to ensnare me, but only eerie silence pressed against my eardrums, like I'd been swaddled in cotton batting. The air felt thick enough to cut with a knife, heavy with the musk of rotting vegetation and something fouler, a rank animal reek that turned my stomach and clogged my nostrils. I knew that scent, had smelled it on the wind moments before the creature appeared. It was here, watching. My hand crept to my belt, seeking the reassuring steel of my knife, but my fingers closed on empty air. The sheath was gone, along with the rest of my gear. I had nothing, I realized, my breath hitching in my throat. No food, no water, not even the clothes on my back were suited for a trek through the backcountry. And something told me this chase would not end until only one of us was left standing. Gritting my teeth against the fear churning in my gut, I pushed off from the tree, aiming for the far side of the clearing. I had to keep moving, had to find a way back to my truck before exhaustion or my pursuer caught up with me. But I'd barely taken a step when something caught my eye, snagging my gaze like a fishhook. There, on the furrowed bark, 4 ragged slashes, oozing sap like blood, and lower, caught on a protruding knot, a few strands of wiry fur, and a shred of mottled green fabric. Bile scorched the back of my throat. It was here, marking its territory, leaving just enough sign to taunt me with its presence while staying maddeningly out of sight. I whirled to scan the tree line, my heart jackhammering against my ribs, but the shadows rippled like water, offering no hint of the nightmare lurking in their depths. Then a howl shattered the stillness, so close it felt like icy claws dragged down my spine. An unearthly wail, not quite wolf, not quite human, the undulating notes crawling under my skin until I wanted to scream. As if in response, a chorus of yips and barks rose all around me, filling the woods until it was impossible to tell from which direction the threat came. I was surrounded, the noose drawing tight around my neck, breath sobbing in my lungs. I dropped into a sprinter's crouch, swiveling to face the thickest tangle of undergrowth. My only chance was to break through, to outrun them for just a little longer. 1 breath, 2, and then I was off, crashing into the brush with all the grace of a wounded elk. Thorns raked my cheeks, sword ferns lashed my knees, but I barely felt them, all my being focused on the primal need to flee. I didn't make it 10 yards. A huge black shape lunged from the tree line to my right, a blur of fur and teeth and glowing eyes. I tried to dodge, but the creature moved too fast, an oily shadow flowing around me in a dizzying spiral. Dimly I registered a massive body perched on legs too long and sinuous to be wolf or bear, a flattened skull like a viper's, a lolling tongue dripping ochre foam between dagger fangs. Then a blow like a battering ram took me in the chest, hurling me to the ground so hard the air whooshed from my lungs. Spots swam before my eyes as I struggled to rise, but an enormous paw pinned me effortlessly. Hot carrion-scented breath plumed over my face as the beast lowered its muzzle, baring teeth as long as my hand. Terror blanked my mind of everything but a single crystalline thought. So this is how I die. But instead of the killing strike, I felt that sticky tongue slither up my cheek, tracing the blood welling from the thorn scratches. A shiver racked the creature's frame, a deep coughing growl rattling its chest. Almost like laughter. It was savoring my fear, rolling the taste of it over its tongue like a fine wine. Delicious, it rumbled, the words marbled with savage amusement. I will enjoy breaking you, little mouse. A choked whimper crawled up my throat. In a haze of animal panic, I writhed beneath its bulk, but my struggles only made it tighten its grip, claws piercing my shirt to dimple the skin beneath. None of that now, it chided, cold mirth dancing in its ember eyes. The game is far from over. You still have much to suffer before I feast. Its jaws gaped as if to sample my flesh. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the white-hot lance of pain, but in the next instant the crushing weight vanished from my chest. My eyes flew open, flicking wildly around the clearing. It was empty. No hulking beasts. No burning eyes in the shadows. Only the motionless sentinels of the trees, and the ghostly skeins of mist twining between them. For a moment I lay stunned, gulping air, wondering if the whole thing had been some sort of fever dream. Then my shredded shirt snagged on a bramble as I pushed upright, and the biting sting of punctured flesh told me it had been all too real. Slowly fighting the rubbery weakness in my legs, I climbed to my feet, scanning the forest's menacing silhouettes. Nothing moved in the gloom. No lurking presence raised the hairs on my nape, but I knew it was out there, watching, waiting for me to drop my guard. The game is far from over, it had said. The words rang in my skull as I staggered in the direction I prayed the truck was parked. Because to this creature, that's all I was, a game piece to be toyed with and tormented, my agonized thrashing the sweetest of nectars. And it would never let me leave the board. Branches clawed at my face and arms as I stumbled through the underbrush, thorns leaving burning kisses on my skin. Sweat and blood mingled beneath my ragged shirt, plastering the fabric to my chest. My breath came in shallow, panicked gasps, and black spots crowded the edges of my vision. I felt like a rabbit in a snare, each desperate jump only drawing the wire tighter. But beneath the gibbering terror, a dull rage pulsed. How dare this creature hunt me through the forest that was my sworn duty to protect? How dare it violate the sanctity of the wilderness, twisting the beauty and grandeur of the land into a theater of horrors? I was a ranger, a guardian of these ancient trees. I would not lay down my life as a sheep to slaughter. As if in answer to my fury, the trees began to thin, the grasping nets of blackberries giving way to a carpet of soft duff. I hardly dared hope, but as I rounded a massive broken-topped cedar, there it was, a small cabin hunched beneath the towering evergreens, its rough-hewn logs weathered to silver. A sagging porch, an overhanging shake roof, a crooked stovepipe jutting from one moss-softened corner. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. My feet propelled me toward it before I could think better. A sanctuary. Supplies. Maybe even another human being. The possibilities tumbled through my exhausted brain. But as I crossed the weed-choked yard, a frisson of unease cut through the haze of desperation. No warm light spilling from the windows. No curl of smoke from the stovepipe. The place had an abandoned feel, a stillness that went beyond emptiness. A quick glance over my shoulder told me the night was still dogging my heels, the dark boughs shivering with unseen malice. Jaw clenched, I mounted the porch, noting the spots where the floorboards had rotted away. Up close, the little structure looked even more decrepit. Shutters hanging askew, roof thick with leaf litter, door gray and warped beneath a dusting of cobwebs. Clearly no one had lived here for a long time. But if I could just get inside, bar the door, catch my breath. I tried the knob and nearly sobbed with relief when it turned beneath my hand, the door swinging open with a rusty creak. Stale air that hadn't stirred in decades washed over me as I stumbled across the threshold, but I gulped it like the freshest mountain breeze. With shaking fingers, I groped for a latch, a bolt, anything to put a barrier between myself and the hulking shadows gathering at the tree line. Nothing. Of course there was nothing. This far from civilization, what was there to keep out but the wildlife? I nearly laughed at the bitter irony, settling for jamming a splintered chair beneath the knob. It wouldn't hold for a second if the creature decided to come crashing through, but it made me feel a little less exposed. That task done, I turned to survey my temporary sanctuary, a small front room, thick with the fug of mildew and rotting wood. A few pieces of rough-hewn furniture, their original colors lost beneath a furry coating of mold. An ancient pot-bellied stove squatting in one corner, its mica windows cracked and sooty. And everywhere, the detritus of long abandonment. A moth-eaten wool blanket, a rusted coffee pot, a plate still crusted with the remains of a meal. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, the objects began to take on a sinister cast. An old leather harness hanging on a hook studded with dull iron rings. A coil of frayed rope, its fibers stained a telltale brown. And there, half hidden beneath a grimy cabinet, a scattering of small white objects, too regular to be pebbles or fallen plaster. With a sense of deepening dread, I knelt and plucked one from the dust, rolling it between my fingers. It was a tooth, a human molar, its root snapped off close to the gum line, as if it had been ripped from a screaming jaw. Cold sweat pricked my hairline as I raised my head, really seeing the room for the first time. Those dark stains splashed up the walls weren't just mildew. The gouges in the floorboards weren't from the claws of an animal, and the heavy cloying stench that permeated everything soaked into the very logs. It was the feeder of rot and ruin, old blood and wasted meat. My gorge rose as the truth crashed over me like a wave of icy seawater. This wasn't a mere abandoned shell. This was a charnel house, a monstrous den where the creature brought its prey. How many hapless wanderers had met their end within these walls, pleading for a mercy that would never come? From the thick crust of filth coating every surface, from the pitted gouges in the floor that could only have been left by fingernails, dozens, maybe more. And now I had blundered straight into its lair, like a lamb delivered to the butcher's block. The urge to bolt seized me, to fling myself back out into the night and take my chances with the forest. But even as I staggered to my feet, a guttural chuckle sounded from the shadows, a laugh I had heard before, mocking me from the depths of the woods. Welcome home, little mouse. My breath locked in my throat as a shape detached from the darkest corner, unfolding into the familiar nightmare of two long limbs and twitching, hairless flesh. In the guttering light from the cracked window, I saw its face fully for the first time. Not wholly wolf, not quite human, but some obscene melding of the two. Jagged fangs jutted from a lipless maw, and eyes that glowed like live coals fixed me with a look of cruel intelligence. I must say you've led me on quite the merry chase. It prowled closer, its voice a rumbling purr that set my teeth on edge. None of the others lasted nearly so long. You'll be a rare treat to savor. The dull rage that had carried me this far flared again, bright as a magnesium flare. I snatched up the ancient coffee pot and brandished it before me, as if the rusted tin could hold the beast at bay. Why? I snarled, my voice cracking. Why are you doing this? A rasping chuckle. Why does the wolf hunt the deer? The eagle dive upon the hare? It slunk closer still, its sulphurous reek choking the air from my lungs. It is my nature, little mouse, as it will be your nature to scream and thrash and fight until the last bit of sweet marrow is cracked from your bones. I knew then that there would be no reasoning with the creature, no appeal to mercy or human feeling. It was a being of pure predatory instinct, as soulless as the void between stars, and it would never stop, never rest, until it had glutted itself on my terror and my flesh. Still clutching my makeshift weapon, I backed toward the far wall, my mind spinning furiously. There had to be something, some advantage I could press, some way to turn its twisted games back on it. But even as I groped for a plan, my heels struck something soft and yielding, a pile of fabric, heaped against the baseboard like old rags. No, not rags. A tangle of rotting clothing, jutting with pale knobs of bone, the tattered remains of the creature's previous victims. My stomach lurched violently, and I tasted bile at the back of my throat. But as I stared down at that pathetic mound, my eyes snagged on a glint of metal, almost buried beneath a moth-eaten flannel. A knife. A huntsman's blade. Its steel blackened with old blood. It must have belonged to one of the poor fools who had tried to fight, to cling to life until their last breath was ripped from their lungs. Almost without thought, I stooped and closed my fingers around the hilt, the ridged bone biting into my palm. The creature gave a hacking laugh, its stench rolling over me in a noisome wave. Still some fight left in you, I see. Good, good. It's no fun if you break too quickly. But I barely heard it over the sudden roaring in my ears, the red haze that descended over my vision. I was done being toyed with, done scurrying and squeaking on command. If I was going to die, it would be on my feet, with a blade in my hand and defiance on my tongue. I hefted the knife, feeling the solid weight of it, the keenness of the edge, and for the first time since I had set foot in this benighted forest, I felt the stirrings of something other than fear. I felt rage, hot and bright as the heart of a forge. Come on then, I spat, baring my teeth in a feral grin. Let's finish this. The beast's eyes flared, and its lips skinned back from its fangs in a delighted snarl. As you wish, little mouse. And it lunged. Faster than thought, faster than instinct. The creature flowed across the rotting floorboards, a blur of shadow and teeth and billowing stench. I had half expected it to toy with me, to draw out my torment as it had in the clearing, but there was no playfulness in its charge now. Only the single-minded intent of an apex predator moving in for the kill. I slashed wildly with the knife, more a spasm of desperation than any true attempt to connect. But even that clumsy swing forced the beast to whip its head aside, its snarl of frustration giving me a precious half-second to dart along the wall. The rough log scraped my shoulder as I scuttled sideways, trying to put the hulking stove between myself and my attacker. The knife felt like a toothpick in my sweat-slick grip, a child's weapon against the horror that paced me from the shadows. For a heartbeat, I thought I might actually make it to the front door, might actually win free to lose myself in the labyrinth of the forest. Then a huge black shape leaped over the stove as easily as a mote of dust, hitting the wall beside my head with an impact that rattled the teeth in my skull. I cried out and stumbled back, my legs tangling in the strap of a rotting knapsack. I went down hard, breath whooshing from my lungs as my back slammed into the floorboards. The knife jarred from my grip and skittered into the shadows, vanishing as utterly as a pebble down a well. Above me, the creature loomed like a thunderhead, its eyes two pits of smoldering hellfire in the gloom. Enough games, it growled, its voice like millstones grinding against each other. Your fear has whetted my appetite long enough. Now it's time to feast. I scrabbled backwards on my elbows, kicking out as a taloned hand swiped at my legs. My heel connected with something hard and unyielding, and the creature roared, more in rage than pain. I kicked again, aiming for those furnace eyes, that lamprey mouth bristling with teeth, but it was like striking a side of beef. The beast absorbed the blows without flinching, its bulk pinning me to the floor like a bug on a corkboard. My, but you are a feisty one, it purred, its gaze roving over me with obscene hunger. I will enjoy cracking your bones and suckling the marrow as you scream. The oily rasp of its voice shredded the last of my composure. The fear that I had pushed down, held at bay with anger and adrenaline, came howling back like a black tide. I thrashed and writhed, fingernails scrabbling at the weathered planks, but it was like fighting a landslide. The creature pressed closer, its breath a fetid blast, until I could feel the heat radiating from its grotesque bulk. Yes, it hissed, a purplish tongue darting out to lap at the blood and sweat streaking my face. Scream for me, little mouse. Let me taste your sweet terror. And I did scream then, a high, ululating wail that tore at my larynx and pulsed behind my eyes. But it was not the scream of a victim, the helpless bleating of a yearling calf in the jaws of a grizzly. It was a cry of rage and defiance, the roar of a creature pushed beyond all endurance. I would not give this monster what it wanted. I would not let it break me. My hand, groping blindly at my side, closed on something cold and unyielding. A cracked clay jug wedged against the wall where it had sat for decades. With a wordless yell, I swung it up and around, putting every fiber of my being into the blow. It struck the side of the creature's skull with a sickening thunk, and I felt something give beneath the impact, like a pumpkin caving under a sledgehammer. The beast reeled back with a high yowl, black ichor sluicing down its furred cheek. The pressure on my chest vanished, and I gulped air, thrusting myself up on my elbows. I had heard it. Fang and claw and preternatural strength, but the monster could be hurt. Snarling, it pawed at its wound, hooked talons scraping furrows in the matted skin. But when its eyes found mine again, I saw no pain in their smoldering depths, only a rage to match my own, an unfathomable hatred that seared my mind like a brand. "You dare," it grated, the words bubbling through a mouthful of blood and broken teeth. "You insignificant prey animal. You would raise hand to me?" I pushed myself to my feet, wincing as abused muscles screamed in protest. My whole body felt like one giant bruise, but I locked my knees and lifted my chin, meeting the beast's infernal gaze without flinching. "I dare," I said, and my voice rang from the pitted rafters like a war horn. "I am a daughter of the forest, a guardian sworn. You are the interloper here, the unclean thing, and I will not let you defile these woods a moment longer." It threw back its head and loosed a howl, a sound of such fury and madness that the very logs seemed to tremble. Then, in a movement too swift to follow, it lunged. Lunged not for me, but for the rope still dangling from the wall. One moment it was coiled on its rusty hook, a relic of some long-ago trapper's snare. The next it was whipping through the air, a blur of hemp and mold and glinting fibers. It lashed across my face like a cat o' nine tails, and I cried out more in shock than pain. I raised my hands to shield my head, and then the rope was wrapping around my wrists, around my arms, pinning them to my sides as it squeezed like a constrictor. I gasped and strained against the crushing coils, but it was like fighting iron bands. My feet skidded on the blood-slick floor as the beast dragged me closer, reeling me in like a gasping fish. Defiant to the last, it rasped, its ruined face splitting in a ghastly parody of a smile. "But in the end you are still only meat and fear and screaming nerves. And now, little mouse, you are mine." It seized a fistful of my hair and wrenched my head back, baring my throat. I felt the keen of its claws against my jugular, the searing heat of its breath as it lowered its jaws to the frantic pulse hammering beneath my skin. I squeezed my eyes shut, not wanting the creature's leering smirk to be the last thing I saw. An image of Jen swam up behind my lids. Her gentle smile, the honey-warm smell of her hair, the way she crinkled her nose when she laughed. "I'm sorry, my love," I thought, as hot tears slipped down my cheeks. "I'm sorry I couldn't keep my promise. I'm sorry I couldn't come home to you." The creature growled, a basso rumble like thunder over the mountains. Its fangs scraped my skin, and I braced myself for the piercing, for the rush of blood and the merciful fall into darkness. But the pain never came. Instead, the pressure at my neck suddenly vanished, and a howl like all the souls in hell split the air above me. My eyes flew open to see the beast reeling back, its muzzle a ruin of blood and torn flesh, and there, jutting from the wreckage of its cheek, the hilt of my forgotten knife, buried to the crossguard in the monster's flesh. It had been there all along, I realized, hidden in the shadows where I had dropped it, waiting for the moment when the creature's grip loosened, when some wild swing of my bound arms chanced to connect. And now the keen steel bit deep, worrying at nerves and sinew and the putrid black blood that was the beast's life. The creature pawed at the blade with a keening wail, but its talons only drove the metal deeper. Gobbets of stinking meat splattered the floor as it shook its head wildly, spraying ichor in a glistening arc. But still the knife held fast, worrying, cutting, killing. In that moment, as I watched the monster that had stalked me, tormented me, sought to make me a toy for its depraved hungers, writhe and mewl in helpless agony, I felt a vicious, terrible thrill. The kind of atavistic glee that vibrates in the human hindbrain, the ancient exaltation of prey become predator. It was the beast's turn to cower now, its turn to know the sick horror of a tightening noose. My lips skinned back from my teeth in a wolfish grin. "Not so mighty now, are you?" I hissed, my voice rough with battle fury. "Not so eager to toy with your food." I twisted in my bonds, wriggling one blood-slick arm free of the rope's stranglehold. Reaching down, I fumbled at my belt until my fingers closed on the cool metal of my ranger's badge, heavy and solid in my grip. I ripped it free with a jerk, feeling the pin tear through the fabric of my shirt. Then, before the creature could recover, before it could do more than fix me with a look of incredulous, agonized hatred, I struck. I brought the badge down like a hammer, like an avenging angel's sword. The metal points pierced the beast's bulbous eye with a wet squelch, and it threw back its head with an ear-splitting shriek. I wrenched the impromptu weapon free in a welter of blood and humors, and then I was swinging again, slamming the badge into that thrashing muzzle, that lolling tongue, those gnashing teeth. Again and again I rained down blows, the dull thud of metal on meat and bone filling the cabin, drowning out the creature's yelps and my own panting breaths. Black spots crowded my vision, and my arm ached with a deep searing throb, but I didn't falter, didn't allow myself the luxury of exhaustion. This wretched thing had thought to make me a victim. Now I would teach it the fury of the victimized. At last, after a small eternity, I felt the badge connect with something harder than flesh. The grisly crack of shattering bone reverberated up my arm, and the creature convulsed, a full-body spasm like a beached fish. Then, with a last rattling moan, it crumpled to the blood-slicked floor and lay still. For a long, numb moment, I could only stare at the twisted shape that had been my tormentor. Its chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven gasps, and its remaining eye darted beneath a half-closed lid, but it did not stir, did not so much as twitch in my direction. The monster, the nightmare, the invincible beast of shadow and hunger, beaten at last, broken beneath my hands like the lowliest cur. A laugh bubbled up my throat, tasting of copper and madness. I let it spill from my lips, not caring that it bordered on a sob, not caring that my face was wet with tears and the creature's thick, stinking blood. I had won. Against all odds, against any sane reckoning, I had beaten the thing that had sought to break me. Never again, I vowed, as I stood swaying over the ruin I had made. Never again would I be prey. Never again would I cower or cringe before my fears. From this night forward, I was done being hunted. I was the hunter now. In the gray, guttering light of dawn, the forest looked almost peaceful. Mist curled between the trees, softening their edges, turning the gnarled trunks into half-seen phantoms. A few early birds trilled tentatively from the canopy, as if testing whether the long night had truly passed. And high above, visible through a gap in the bone-white branches, a single star still glimmered, fading slowly into the brightening sky. It might have been beautiful, had I been in any frame of mind to appreciate it. But as I stumbled from the cabin on legs that barely obeyed me, all I could feel was a numb, gnawing dread. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the long hours of darkness had deserted me, and in its wake came a sick, shocky emptiness, as if some vital part of me had been scooped out. I had won. I had beaten the monster, left it broken and bleeding on the rotten floorboards. But at what cost? The ranger who had entered these woods, who had sworn to safeguard the forest and its creatures, she was gone, shattered like the beast's skull beneath the pitiless metal of my badge. In her place was a creature I barely recognized, a husk animated only by the memory of fear and the bitter dregs of rage. I had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back, and now I would never be clean of its touch. Numbly, moving as if in a dream, I set off into the lightning woods. I had no direction, no goal save to put one foot in front of the other, to keep moving until I found what? Civilization? Rescue? Redemption? They all seemed like far distant mirages, shimmering mockingly beyond reach. Time slipped by in a haze, and the sun climbed slowly toward its zenith. The mist burned away, and the forest came alive with the chatter of squirrels and the foraging of deer. Normally the sight would have brought me a measure of peace, but now all I could see were potential threats lurking behind every trunk and tussock. The hunter's instinct, once awakened, would not easily be put back to sleep. It was in that state, jumping at shadows and twitching at every snapped twig, that I stumbled into a small clearing and found myself face to face with a search party. For a moment we could only gape at each other. The three burly men in their orange vests, and the wild-eyed, blood-spattered wraith that I had become. Then one of them took a tentative step forward, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Ranger Chantal," he asked, his voice low and soothing, as if gentling a spooked horse. "Are you all right, ma'am?" A bark of laughter, brittle and unhinged, tore from my throat. All right? I would never be all right again, but I couldn't say that, couldn't give voice to the howling void that had opened inside me, so I simply nodded, letting my matted hair fall across my face. "I'm fine," I rasped, the words like broken glass in my mouth. "Just got a little lost." The men exchanged glances, and I saw the doubt flicker across their faces. But to their credit, they didn't press me, just nodded solemnly and gently took my arms, guiding me back the way they had come with murmured assurances that everything would be okay, that I was safe now. But even as I let them lead me through the dappled sunlight, even as the promise of hot food and clean clothes and human contact beckoned. I knew it for the comforting lie it was. I would never be safe. Not truly. The forest would never again be a place of wonder and refuge for me. Because I knew now what lurked in its shadowed heart. I had seen the face of true evil, had grappled with it and torn it apart with my bare hands, and in doing so I had left a piece of myself in that blood-soaked cabin, a piece I would never get back. The monster was dead, but as I emerged from the tree line and caught sight of the rescue vehicles, the flashing lights and shouted orders and crush of humanity that seemed suddenly terribly alien, I wondered if perhaps it had taken me with it, if some essential part of me had been devoured, leaving only a brittle shell behind. I had won my life. But my soul, my sanity, my very sense of self, those were still in the belly of the beast, being slowly digested in an acid of primal terror and base brutality. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how many years and miles I put between myself and these haunted woods, I knew I would never truly escape. The creature had left its mark on me, indelible as a brand. I was a thing of blood and shadow now, my humanity sloughed away like a snake's outgrown skin. The hunt was over, but the hunger would never end. As I stepped into the arms of my rescuers, letting their concern and relief wash over me like a tide, I allowed myself a secret savage smile. The beast was not the only predator in these woods, not anymore. And someday, inevitably, I would return to my hunting grounds. After all, I had promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep.